and welcome to episode 60 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Hennig. On this edition of the podcast, we're going to do something very different than we usually do. A very interesting topic came up this week on the internet, and it spread all over the place. It was like 4 days worth of people giving up their rankings of the Spider-Man movies. And my general takeaway from those rankings were that people who were ranking them were either putting it based on recency bias, or they don't really have an understanding of Spider-Man and the characters at all. So I want to give you, as objective as humanly possible, a true breakdown of all the Spider-Man feature films that have hit theaters since 2000, give you their rankings, and explain to you the positives and negatives of every single one. Because honestly, even the best ones, none of them were perfect. So let's open up a cold one and get started on episode 60 of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. So full disclosure, I have not been able to find the origin of this rank your best Spider-Man movies conversation. It seems that it has bounced around a lot of social media platforms, some major social media entities that cover movies and comic books and all that kind of stuff. But somewhere in the depths of the internet, it started this conversation of ranking the best to worst Spider-Man movies. And the reason why I want to talk about it here on the Mutant Blitz Podcast is because, one, we do talk about comic movies and television shows here on the pod, but also I think that one of the things that gets misunderstood about comic book movies is comic book movies are meant to be interpretations of the source material, an execution on the largest scale, a movie screen, of something that was already laid out, portrayed in a comic book. One of the problems with previous iterations of characters before the Marvel Cinematic Universe came along is that a lot of the movies and television shows, and even many of the cartoons, frankly, were very inaccurate to the source material. They either reinterpreted the storylines, they totally destroyed some of the history of the characters, or they made the characters into something that they are not. So I think that when it comes to the movies, whether they're in the MCU or outside, there are criticisms to be made of all of them. No movie is perfect. No movie gets everything right. And not that you have to be accurate to the source material, but there's a level of integrity. There's a spirit of the material. There's an original intent that comes with character creation, that if you're going to use a character created by somebody else, whether it's a comic book, whether it's a written novel, whether it is a screenplay, whether it's a Broadway show, whatever it may be, if you're going to use the same name, Spider-Man, or whatever it may be, there is a unspoken trust given to the entity making the movie or television show to say, you may tell your own story, you may have your own interpretation, but you still have a requirement, an unspoken responsibility to be loyal to the spirit of the source material, the original intent and formation of the character, and what made it so popular and interesting for you to even consider making it into a feature film. So I think that a lot of that does not get talked about when it comes to these movies. The other thing that doesn't get talked about enough is the performance of the people in their roles. You may not have a great story, but the execution of the characters in the movie still should be highlighted, still should be talked about. For example, when you go back and look at a movie, a non-Marvel Cinematic Universe movie, like the Fantastic Four, the first two that had Jessica Alba playing Sue Storm, for as mediocre as those movies were, Jessica Alba actually did a good job portraying Sue Storm, executing an understanding of her power set, portraying her relationship with Reed Richards. That was something good done in the movie. The execution of those movies, the storylines, the fight scenes, the CGI, The special effects left a lot to be desired. And what made those movies frustrating for a lot of people was you had an opportunity to do some really big and cool things, and it felt like you wasted it. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that you got to measure all the positives and negatives. And because of recency bias, and because a lot of people tend to look at certain people and characters and not be honest and upfront about those characters and those films, they're not giving it the full breadth of evaluation. Now, when making my as objective as humanly possible list of the Spider-Man movies, my keys to these rankings are: number one, strength of story. How well was it written? How well was it executed, the story that was written? What you're seeing on the screen. If the character was not Spider-Man, would it still be a solid or good movie? That's what I mean by strength of story. The second key to my rankings is the commitment to being authentic to the spirit of the source material. So, when Stan Lee created Spider-Man, and when Steve Ditko worked with Stan Lee in the 60s to execute the character, and then years later, everyone else who has ever written a Spider-Man comic or drawn Spider-Man in the comics, the spirit of Spider-Man has, for the most part, consistently had a certain aspect to the character. There's a level of awkwardness to Peter Parker. There is a level of innocence that comes with the character of Spider-Man. There is a skill set that Spider-Man has when it comes to intelligence that is consistent throughout the 40 plus years of the comic book character. There is also an aspect to his relationships with the people around him. Aunt May, Mary Jane, Gwen Stacy, Harry Osborn, the villains like the Lizard, Vulture. There's a lot that goes into this character. So when you have a character that was created in the early 1960s and you have a fairly consistent element outside of 2 runs of the comic, the Clone Saga, which was an absolute embarrassment and abomination, and then the whole situation that happened when Peter Parker was no longer Spider-Man and he died, and then you have Miles Morales come along. Outside of those 2 major events, Peter Parker and Spider-Man has consistently had specific elements to his character, his personality, and then Spider-Man and his relation to the world around him. The third key element is quality of the cast and their performance. You can have a great writer, but if the actor cannot execute the writing, you're going to get a so-so movie. You can have a great actor, but if the writing is so-so, the actor can only do so much with the script given to him and the environment that he is in. So that's why you have to factor in the cast as well. So whether it's Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, Tom Holland, all 3 of them have positives and negatives that they bring to the table as the character. And we're going to get into this as we review each of these films. Also, do not overlook the supporting cast around Spider-Man, okay? Emma Stone played Gwen Stacy. You've had 2 different MJs. You have the Kirsten Dunst version of Mary Jane Watson. And then in Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, you have a totally different version called MJ, played by Zendaya. So you have that element to factor in. Also, you have had different versions of Flash Thompson. You've had different versions now of a couple different characters. Aunt May, for example, in Spider-Man's immediate circle. Also, his relation to the rest of the world. Spider-Man being in the MCU is very different than Spider-Man as a standalone superhero in New York as he was in previous movies. So you kind of have to balance all of those things when looking at these characters. So I'm going to first give you my 1 through 8. I'm going to give you all 8, 1 through 8, just rapid fire. And then I'm going to go back into each ranking and explain why, from 8 through 1, why I ranked them this way. Okay? So, my number 1 Spider-Man movie all time is Spider-Man 2. That is 2004. That is Tobey Maguire. That is when Spider-Man has to deal with Dr. Octavius. The number 2 movie on my rankings is Spider-Man 1, the original Spider-Man movie, 2002, when the villain was Harry Osborn, Green Goblin. My number 3 Spider-Man movie is Spider-Man Homecoming. That is the first movie with Tom Holland when he is dealing with a world after meeting Tony Stark. Then you have Spider-Man 1, or otherwise known as The Amazing Spider-Man with Andrew Garfield, that came out in 2012. My number 5 one is Spider-Man Far From Home. That is the immediate movie that came out after Avengers Endgame and is the final movie of Phase 3 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe chronology. My number 6 movie is the Sony cartoon production Into the Spider-Verse, because it's being listed by a lot of people out there. I have to include it. We have to talk about it, but I have it at number 6. The number 7 movie is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. That is the second Andrew Garfield movie. And then number 8 is the third Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi movie, Spider-Man 3, dealing with villains like Venom and Sandman. So that's my 1 through 8. Let's now go through each of the movies and give you a better understanding of why these rankings are the way they are. And by the way, listen, when a comment on the video down below on YouTube, shoot me a message on Twitter, at Josh Hennig on Twitter. Let's debate this. Let's discuss this. But here are my explanation for why I rank this before you go debating with me. So Spider-Man 3, which was the third film of the Tobey Maguire, Sam Raimi saga that came out in 2007. So the reason why I rank this as the worst of the movies is because of the fact that this is absolutely the worst portrayal of everything in Spider-Man's universe. This is the worst written story. This is the worst executed of everything of the Spider-Man movies. Now, before we get to the negatives, the positives are Thomas Hayden Church does an excellent job portraying the complexities of the Sandman villain and the tormented person Flint Marko. Also, the version of Eddie Brock is in line with the intent of the character's origin in the comics, and Topher Grace is very underrated in his performance. I think that Church and Grace did a very good job portraying complex characters with a lot that's going on in the movie and with the origin and the intent of the character. Both of them did a great job. Frankly, that's the only positive I got for the movie. The negatives break down to this. This version of Peter Parker is a whiny complainer who rarely takes responsibility, treats his girlfriend Mary Jane like garbage, has a totally dysfunctional relationship with everyone around him, and frankly, he is the dumbest genius of any superhero movie of all time. Peter Parker is supposed to be one of the 5 smartest, most intelligent geniuses in all of Marvel Comics. And this movie makes him out to be a bumbling, stumbling imbecile who can't get a grip on his emotions. The whole symbiote storyline, which, again, is a thing that's pretty well documented in the comics. And even if you're an intermediate comic book fan, you've probably seen some story or heard some story about how this works. Well, in the movie, it was so poorly well executed. The symbiote turns Peter Parker into an emo, angry Spider-Man and basically a miserable human being. And that whole concept is horrible. That is not what is supposed to happen with the character. That is a horrible execution. And I get it. You were trying to appeal to a certain generation of people, but it was a horribly done job. The movie wastes the character of Venom, and it was completely rushed. You wait until about 30 minutes left in the movie, and you have Eddie Brock becoming Venom. It's never elaborated about how Eddie Brock so quickly becomes a supervillain. Yes, they have this whole lead up to why being Venom is a villain and why he would be an adversary for Spider-Man and why the Venom symbiote and Eddie Brock would work together. It's explained. We understand. We get it. But then you rush into this fight, and the fight was poorly executed. The explanation of the fight was poorly executed. And then all of a sudden, you get James Franco as the new Green Goblin coming in. That was a waste. James Franco, you had the previous two movies, the build on this character. You had two movies where James Franco's Harry Osborn, his relationship with Peter Parker, his relationship with Mary Jane Watson, his relationship with everything in Spider-Man's world has been developed, and then you just throw out this practically vomit of his role in the movie. And then you have the introduction of Gwen Stacy. Okay, fine. You have a nice job by Bryce Dallas Howard of a character, but the character is not Gwen Stacy. I don't know who this character is, but it's not Gwen Stacy. And yeah, Gwen Stacy's father, Captain Stacy, played by James Cromwell. James Cromwell is the prototype cop in this role. Okay? Cool. I get it. But look, this was so poorly executed. What people don't understand who are new to Spider-Man is that Gwen Stacy was the original love interest of Spider-Man in the comics. Mary Jane Watson came in later after Gwen Stacy died. Gwen Stacy was not Peter Parker's first love. Now, listen, I can get over that because the first movie and the second movies were so well written and so well executed that I said, you know what? Okay, I can work with the fact that you changed some of the origin story. You changed some of the history behind this relationship. I can work around that. But then you don't throw Gwen Stacy into the third movie and totally adulterate the entire concept of the relationship and the purpose of the relationship between all the parties involved. On top of all of that is the reason why this is such a violation. Stan Lee created Gwen Stacy in the image of his own wife. She was supposed to be this ideal person to balance out Peter Parker, the ideal person to understand Peter Parker. Well, the version of Gwen Stacy in Spider-Man 3, frankly, is nothing like the original character. The other problem I have with this movie is that this idea that Flint Marko is the killer of Uncle Ben is a reach and unorthodox, since most of Spider-Man's rogues gallery of villains are complicated characters who are not meant to have any real connection to the death of Uncle Ben. Peter Parker's origin is meant to be a variation of Bruce Wayne. When Stan Lee wrote Peter Parker, the idea was that we were taking a concept that we've already seen with young man loses his parents and someone else becomes a surrogate parent. All right. But the idea is that Peter Parker's connection to Uncle Ben was supposed to be something that stuck with him the rest of his life in a way that the death of Bruce Wayne's parents couldn't, because it happens a little bit older when Peter Parker is not as young as Bruce Wayne was. This would be like telling in a Batman story where the Joker has been the person who killed Batman's parents from years ago. It just cheapens the whole story. It ruins the concept that all of Spider-Man's villains are meant to be people who there's a reason why they became evil. They haven't always been evil. And then they try to justify, oh, Flint Marko didn't mean to kill the guy. It just happened to be an accident. Like, it just felt so poorly done. The whole movie is just a mess. And they should have never, ever made it. My number 7 movie, the second worst of the Spider-Man movies, is The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So this is the second movie with Andrew Garfield in it. Let's remind people this came out in 2014. So this movie comes out in the heart of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its popularity. You are about 6 years removed from the first Iron Man movie when this movie is starting to be promoted and then comes out. This was supposed to be the movie that launched Sony's Spider-Verse, okay? The idea originally behind this movie was Sony was going to use this movie to launch a whole list of movies, okay? This was supposed to launch a Sinister Six movie and a new Venom movie and a new entire world built on all Spider-Man characters. The failure of this movie in terms of execution and It's frankly poor reception at the box office and by fans is what led to the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies coming to the MCU. This failure, this movie's problems are what led to Tom Holland and Spider-Man being in the Marvel Cinematic Universe altogether. Now, Andrew Garfield, in my opinion, is actually the best action Spider-Man. So, Spider-Man wearing the costume, swinging, in fights, in sequence. He physically and in action is the best Spider-Man, in my opinion. When he moves, he looks like Spider-Man. When he swings, he looks like Spider-Man. When he's in the fight sequences with the Lizard and Electro, he looks like Spider-Man. Emma Stone in both movies has done a great job as Gwen Stacy. Emma Stone completely understood the purpose of Gwen Stacy, the origin of Gwen Stacy, why Gwen Stacy is so important in Spider-Man's life. So you do have that coming from the first to the second movie. Then you have the negatives. Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is probably one of the more awkwardly executed superhero movies I have ever seen. This concept that New York is under siege by Oscorp and that Spider-Man has to protect the city from this growing threat that he frankly doesn't even fully understand. I liked the idea before I saw the movie of, hey, let's introduce Electro. We haven't seen Electro in a movie yet. And then you have Max Dillon being played by Jamie Foxx. I'm like, okay, well, you got a bigger name to play the role. That's fine. And I think that overall, the intent of the movie was fine. But that's when the movie goes off the rails. First of all, there was no reason you needed multiple villains. It was unnecessary. The writers didn't give Electro enough development. It felt like the whole Max Dillon becomes Electro, becomes a villain, was literally rushed. It felt like we were missing steps along the way. Throughout the movie, we are then introduced that there's a massive conspiracy behind the death of Peter's parents that has to do with Oscorp, that has to do with this growing villainous threat that is coming from Oscorp, and that the creation of Electro and Harry Osborn, who used to be Peter's friend, turning into this super villain of the Green Goblin, that all of these elements are all based on this conspiracy. Okay, it might have been an interesting idea, but I don't think it was a well-executed idea. I think that if you would have written it a little differently, it could have been a lot better. It just felt like you were really reaching. Then the audiences are let down completely because you spend the second half of the movie teasing and building toward this great reveal that there could be a Sinister Six, that there's going to be a group of villains that Oscorp is going to unleash on the world, and we never got that because the rest of the movie was so messy. Oh, speaking of messy, all of a sudden, Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy's relationship gets messy. It was sloppy writing. It was sloppily executed by Andrew Garfield. Frankly, Andrew Garfield is the worst version of Peter Parker. He's moody. He's disorganized. I'm misunderstood. The shtick was taken way too far. Dude, we get it. You're a teenager going to college, having to juggle between being a superhero and having your personal life all over the place. Okay? We get it. Life's not perfect. Peter Parker in this movie is really never responsible for anything. And then, spoiler alert, when Gwen Stacy dies near the end of the movie, it just feels like, well, that was rushed too. Because in the comics, Gwen Stacy does die as well. But she dies, I think it was 12, 15 years after Spider-Man was originally introduced. Gwen Stacy was a huge part of Spider-Man's history for years and years and years, and then you killed her off. You killed off Gwen Stacy in the second movie in a whole scenario that felt completely unnecessary. Oh, and by the way, all of a sudden, you took all of this build-up of how great Spider-Man is, at swinging and athletically, and he's so intelligent from the first movie, and then you make him into this complete loser in the second movie who can't deal with two villains because his head is not in the game. Spider-Man 2 would be lower on my list if it wasn't for the fact that Gwen Stacy is 100 times better in this movie than in the third Tobey Maguire movie, and Andrew Garfield, for as much as frustrates me about the movie, frankly did his best with a bad situation. I think that if that script was written by somebody else and the movie was directed by somebody else, that Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 could have frankly been a lot better. I think that Mark Webb really was trying way too hard as the director of this movie. I felt that the writers, Alex Kurtzman and Roberto Orci, should have never been allowed to write this movie. The moment that this landed on Mark Webb's desk and on Sony's desk, they should have said no. Because there was too much focus on building toward the next movie and not enough focus on the actual movie that they were producing. And that's why it was a failure. That's why Tom Holland is Spider-Man. And that's why Spider-Man is in the MCU. All right, my number 6 movie is Spider-Verse. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, okay? Because number one, I don't even like having to explain why Into the Spider-Verse is even on this list. It's only on the list because there's a handful of people who are either huge fans of certain Spider-Man comics who love the movie, or you have a whole group of people who just love cartoon anime, all right? That's really it. This movie was a cute, fun ride. That's it. Nothing else. No other major legitimate value. It was fun, it was interesting, and it was a cartoon. The good thing with the movie is that we're finally going to allow the story of Miles Morales to be introduced to larger audiences. I still don't understand to this day why we had to have a third version of Peter Parker. Why don't we just have Miles Morales in the MCU? That's what we really need. Frankly, I'd be okay if Tom Holland gets killed off in the third movie. Not because he's done a bad job, I think he's done an excellent job. But Miles Morales was the Spider-Man created for the 21st century. Miles Morales was the character created when Marvel was trying to salvage the company after bankruptcy. After Peter Parker's rights were sold away to Sony. After the entire Spider-Man universe was sold away. Brian Michael Bendis came in and he was told by the new heads at Marvel, I want you to tell a whole new Marvel universe. So Brian Michael Bendis created what is known as the Ultimate Marvelverse, the Ultimate Universe, which is where everything in Marvel was retold in the 21st century. So Iron Man, Captain America, Spider-Man, Thor, it's all retold in a world from their origin to their reaching superhero apex in a world that deals with 9/11, that deals with who is the president, that deals with everything in the world as of the early 2000s. All right. And part of that was Bendis decided that he would have a Spider-Man run. He would tell a Spider-Man story. But then other writers decided to create a new Spider-Man. And Miles Morales is the new Spider-Man. And if you go back and read Miles Morales comics, they're fun. They're interesting. It has new life. It gives new energy to a world without Peter Parker. Now, it's a shame the MCU and the Sony could have just done that instead of giving us a third version of Peter Parker. Instead of giving us a 21st century version of Peter Parker, which frankly we've seen now twice before Tom Holland came along, you could have given us Miles Morales and really started from scratch. We didn't get that, so we get Miles Morales in a cartoon movie. All right, fine. I did think that the cartoon feature film allowed the writers and directors and the actors to do a lot more than they can do in a feature film. Obviously, there's a lot less, fight scenes and directing and aspects of an action film that a cartoon can get away with bending certain rules and, making certain twists and turns that you can't get away with in a feature film. Now the negatives. Into the Spider-Verse is a movie that is heavily sourced from a specific modern comic book arc. It is not a movie that draws on the big picture of Spider-Man, Miles Morales, Peter Parker, anything. It's a story that is very different and a bit of a departure from the previous 40 years of Spider-Man stories. And in fact, it's such a departure from the previous 40 plus years of Spider-Man that at the end of this comic book that this movie is based on, they kind of almost undo everything that happens in the comic within a couple years. So you're literally source materialing something that really has no relevance to anything except for the story that it's set in. The fight scenes are less believable, actually, for Spider-Man than the live-action movies. There are things that they have the different Spider-Men do, whether it's Peter Parker, Miles Morales, Spider-Gwen, Spider-Man Noir, all the different Spider-Men that show up in this movie. There are things that they do in this movie that just, they're not believable. You want me to suspend belief for something that doesn't even make sense sometimes. There's no consistency in Spider-Man's strength and abilities. There's no consistency in their execution of those powers and abilities. But yet I'm supposed to suspend belief when my suspension of belief is based on the idea that I'm getting Spider-Man, not whatever that was. The story and the execution of the movie was targeted to youth and not of substance for the older audiences who are the actual diehards for Spider-Man. This movie was made for people who are between the ages of basically 9 and 16, okay? This movie was not made for someone who has spent years reading Spider-Man, or even 2 years, or heck, 18 months reading Spider-Man comics. This movie was legitimately made with the idea that they're introducing Spider-Man to young kids. And frankly, that's a bad idea, because the whole purpose of comic movies is to embrace all audiences. You keep it simple and innocent enough for the youngsters, but you keep it substantive and strong in content for the older audiences. This cartoon doesn't do that. And I think it's a letdown for a lot of diehard Spider-Man fans. Plus, Kingpin, who's the major villain of the movie, looks absolutely ridiculous. What is up with modern cartoons of making people look totally obscure and unbelievable? I wasn't sure if Kingpin was the villain or if it was the guy from, what was it, Despicable Me with the Minions? He looked more like him than Kingpin. And even that looked like more of a human being than the version of Kingpin they put in the movie. It was ridiculous. I don't understand why people love No, I do understand why people love Spider-Verse. Because it's fun, and it's different, and it's cool. I don't care. It's not a Spider-Man movie. It's a movie that uses Spider-Man characters that's made for children who don't know Spider-Man. All right, I'm done complaining. All right, my fifth movie on the list is Spider-Man Far From Home. Tom Holland, again, does a great job in this movie displaying the complexities of being a teenager who's trying to balance the responsibilities of being a superhero and being a friend and having a love interest and keeping everything involved. I think Tom Holland does a better job than all the other actors who play Peter Parker at understanding the balancing act of Peter Parker, the responsibilities, the struggle. You know, I'm growing up, I'm maturing, and I'm trying to figure this out, but I'm just don't have it all figured out. I think Tom Holland has been the best at that. Plus, Jake Gyllenhaal is incredible as Quentin Beck Mysterio. He is manipulative. He is double-crossing. He is deceptive. He makes even the audience believe things until it's revealed later. You think, is maybe Mysterio's a good guy? Maybe we have this all wrong. And then when it's revealed, we're like, whoa, okay, this is a great scheme going on here. Nick Fury, as usual, great. Jon Favreau is as Happy Hogan, great. They're excellent as older male figures in Peter Parker's life and showing the expectations that have been placed on him, while also showing the very different pulls on Peter Parker in his life. They both exemplify the different male figures that Peter Parker needs in his life. For a superhero, he needs someone who's going to keep him accountable. And for his personal life, he needs someone who understands what it's like to be a hero with a complicated personal life. So, and I think the movie overall, outside of Spider-Man, did an excellent job at capping off Phase 3. It showed you what a world is like without Iron Man. It showed you the struggles of the people who knew Iron Man after he was gone. It showed you also the ripple effect of after Endgame, how people are dealing with the blip, as they're calling it, the gap in time, how different the world is in general. And I think that we don't give enough credit to directors sometimes in these movies. I think that where Mark Webb drops the ball, John Watts has excelled in directing these Spider-Man movies, because John Watts went into this saying, listen, I'm being asked to be responsible for the execution of something that is literally impossible to do. I am being asked to do something which is give some clarity and give some finality and basically be the epilogue of the Avengers saga of 2 movies that was so incredibly massive. And I think he does an excellent job at that. All right, now we got to complain about the movie, because there's a reason why it's 5 on my list and not higher. The inconsistencies in Peter Parker's use and knowledge of his powers and abilities is frankly exasperating. I honestly get confused at times about what exactly Peter Parker can and can't do. There has been a gap of time between the end of Homecoming and this movie. We assume some things have happened in between Homecoming and Infinity War. And then at the end of Endgame and Far From Home, there's at least, a couple months? I would think Peter Parker would have a better grasp of his powers and his knowledge of them than that. Also, the fact that he's a little oblivious at times to how to use technology. The whole point, again, of Peter Parker is that he is a super genius. Peter Parker almost accidentally kills somebody because he doesn't know how to use some technology from Tony Parker in the movie. Tony Stark in the movie. So Peter Parker is trying to deal with a problem, and he doesn't understand what he's working with. And as a result, he almost blows up a school bus. Now, he works around, he figures it out, he gets rid of the bomb and everything. But the point is that it feels like, listen, I get it that he's supposed to be like 16, 17 years old, but at some point it's like, you're supposed to be smarter than that. You're supposed to be a super genius, and you're coming off as kind of an oblivious kid. You can't have it both ways. The relationship between Peter Parker and MJ is overly awkward, and it feels forced. By the end of the movie, it looks cute and fun, but the whole process leading up to it, it's really not developed. It could have been done a lot better. JB Smooth's character feels completely wasted. I don't even know why he's in the movie. The mid-credit scene where Mysterio's death triggers the reveal of Spider-Man's identity, to me, is completely unnecessary and rushed. When Peter Parker reveals his identity in the comics, he is an adult who has a family, and his whole life is kind of like at a point where it's very inconvenient for him to reveal his identity, but it's also something that he can handle in terms of maturity. Having a teenager superhero have his identity revealed by a supervillain who's trying to make him look like the bad guy feels like Sony is making the same mistake they did with Spider-Man, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield, they're doing in this movie. You could have saved all that for the third movie. You could have literally opened the third movie with that whole sequence and then gone right into that storyline. But I understand why they did it. They're setting up the next couple Sony movies for a scenario where Venom and Venom 2 and Morbius are functioning in a world where Spider-Man's identity is out there and people think he's a murderer. And you have this rise of the anti-heroes, the rise of these reluctant heroes who are dealing with huge problems in the universe. So I know why they did it. I just don't approve of it. I don't like it. And I don't think it was necessary. Furthermore, and we'll get into this a little bit with Homecoming, what keeps Homecoming and Far From Home being higher on the list is that the obsession of Sony and Marvel of this totally different interpretation of Aunt May, this total misinterpretation of MJ, this total just destruction of the character of Flash Thompson, all the stuff that they do with these different characters, it just feels unnecessary. Ned Leeds, all these classic Spider-Man characters, it just feels unnecessary. I'm just not a fan of totally changing from the source material. You can deviate, you can evolve it, you can progress it, you can advance it. You don't totally change it. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a bit. My number 4 movie on the list, and this is probably high for a lot of people, is The Amazing Spider-Man 1 with Andrew Garfield. I mentioned this earlier. Andrew Garfield is the most believable in-action Spider-Man. When he swings, when he fights, when he moves, when he learns how to be Spider-Man, it's arguably the most believable one. Okay? He looks like a teenager figuring out how to be Spider-Man. He sounds like a teenager learning how to do this. It's the most believable. Andrew Garfield is the worst Peter Parker, but I think he is the best in action Spider-Man. I mentioned earlier Gwen Stacy was Peter Parker's first love in the comics, and this movie does a great job to the true history of Peter Parker's high school love life. Gwen Stacy balances Peter Parker. She's in some ways his conscience. She understands him. She sympathizes with him. And Emma Stone does an excellent job at playing the character. Let's also get into the villain. The villain in The Amazing Spider-Man 1 was something that actually really impressed me, okay? It really impressed me that they went the lizard route, because in the comics, Dr. Kirk Connors is an actual real mentor of Spider-Man, and he has an ongoing role in the comics. And Rhys Ifans does a great job at portraying how complex Dr. Kirk Connors is, his emotional struggles of having an arm, why the lizard is so dangerous, why the villain is so intelligent. I think it's incredible. I think it does a great job. Sally Field playing Aunt May was actually a very smart casting move, and Martin Sheen as Uncle Ben might be, before the MCU, one of the most high-profile castings of any Spider-Man character. So, great job on the casting, great job of the execution of that. Dennis Leary as Gwen Stacy's father, that was cool. That was well done. So, there's a lot of good that this movie actually did. It was not all bad. I think this idea that people act like that the movie is rife with it. No, it wasn't rife with issues. It was actually not bad. The storyline was actually pretty well executed. The cast is actually very good. The villain is everything you want a Spider-Man villain to be. Complicated, misunderstood. Peter Parker tries to reach out to him. He can't get through. He realizes he has to do what needs to be done. And yeah, it's a shame how in some ways the movie ends. They probably could have done more with Dr. Connors and the Lizard, maybe later movies. And I wouldn't be mind seeing at some point somebody bring back that villain and that hero, because Dr. Connors is actually a good person. Does a lot of good scientific research and work in the MCU, Marvel Comics, in different areas. And the Lizard has always been an on-again, off-again problem. And it wouldn't have been a bad idea if you brought back the Lizard for the second movie, and you would have done something where, what if the Lizard is now fully under the control of Dr. Connors? What if Dr. Connors learns how to control the Lizard and how to not be totally animalistic? What if Dr. Connors can be inside the lizard and be less of a monster? What if it was Dr. Connors with Peter Parker Spider-Man in the second Amazing Spider-Man movie, and they're working together to fight Green Goblin and Electro? That could have been an interesting storyline. That could have been something that I could have bought into. And it would have looped together all the elements of the first movie. But you wasted it because you guys are idiots. Anyway, the negatives of the movie was, as I mentioned before, Andrew Garfield's version of Peter Parker is the worst. He's not believable as a high school geek. This whole rebellious streak of Peter Parker is in poor taste. Because Peter Parker's character, in some ways, is supposed to have this innocence and this, I'm misunderstood because I'm a geek, but he's not meant to be a rebellious skateboarder, okay? The origin and spirit of the character gets totally thrown out the door by Garfield and the writers in this situation. And I think that that's really the reason why the second movie failed, because you took something that shouldn't have even been there in the first movie and you tried to take it to the next level and try to evolve the character and grow the character, and you're evolving and growing something that was never meant to be. Spider-Man is not meant to be this emotionally complicated, distraught, woe is me, no one understands me, rebel on a skateboard. No, Peter Parker is a super genius who is trying to find his place in the world and wants to help people and is trying to do the right thing at every turn for everyone. He tries to do the right thing by his girlfriend, tries to do the right thing by Aunt May, tries to do the right thing by his teachers, tries to do the right thing by his mentors, and he's always struggling. And what makes Peter Parker struggle is that he feels like he's never, ever going to live up to the expectations. He's never, ever going to be good enough. And it's that struggle of learning that your best is enough that it elevates Spider-Man. And what makes Spider-Man such an important character is that Spider-Man speaks to young people who are trying to do the right thing, who are trying to overcome, who are trying to get past everything, who are trying to evolve and grow and handle the world. And Peter Parker is meant to be that role model to say, listen, it doesn't matter how difficult your life is, you can do this and you have responsibilities and you can accomplish them just like I did. And Andrew Garfield has no idea how to be that character. Number 3 on my Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man Homecoming. We'll get into why this movie is not higher, why the 2 Tom Holland movies are not higher on the list. But Tom Holland embodies the original intent of the character of Peter Parker. I want to go with the positives first. When Peter Parker was created in the 1960s, the origin of Peter Parker was less about him being a superhero than it was about Peter Parker now has powers, now what? Okay? So this is an origin movie that doesn't retell everything all over again, but does a great job at playing off of the origins and the mythos of Spider-Man. It does a great job at, we don't actually have Uncle Ben getting killed again, but we know he has died. And we don't have to walk through everything that happened before he got bit and then when he got bit and how he became Spider-Man. We're actually dealing with Spider-Man. We're dealing with Peter Parker has powers and abilities. We're dealing with Peter Parker in the 21st century. This is going to be interesting. This is complicated. You know, in a world of Instagram and in a world of social media and balancing being a high schooler with being Spider-Man, and it's all difficult. Oh, and by the way, Tony Stark already brought you to Germany to help him fight in his superhero civil war, and now you're back in New York, and how does that impact a young 15-year-old, 16-year-old young man? Incredible. It's an incredible story. It's an incredibly well done concept. There's so much I love about what they did with this. I bring up the villains a lot. To me, the villains are very important in the execution of the movie. Michael Keaton. What an excellent, unique version of Adrian Toomes. What a very cool concept of interweaving things that have happened in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Spider-Man and a classic villain. I like the fact that this is a different version of Adrian Toomes. I like the fact that you cast somebody who can stand on his own 2 feet, who doesn't need the rest of the cast to uphold him as a villain. The utilization of the relationship between Peter Parker and Tony Stark was great. And the contrast of that with the just ridiculous relationship between Adrian Toomes and Peter Parker is well done as well. The fact that Peter Parker is thinking about dating Toomes' daughter. The fact that Toomes threatens him at the car. I mean, everything that happens in the movie is just awesome. It's great. I never thought I would appreciate a younger Aunt May, but Marissa Tomei does a great job. I never thought I would appreciate Iron Man being involved in Spider-Man's life as a teenager, but it was great. The story's fun. It's interesting, and Spider-Man is believable. We finally have a believable actor playing a teenage Peter Parker. But there are some negatives. There's a reason why this isn't the number 1 movie on my, or number 2 movie on my Spider-Man list. And that is because, as I mentioned earlier, the revisions to MJ, who's supposed to be Mary Jane, but now it's Michelle, which I don't understand where that came from. The revisions to Aunt May, the revisions to Flash Thompson were completely unnecessary. Changing the social dynamics of Peter Parker's life takes away from what makes the character unique. This idea that we had to be socially diverse, and why are all the people in Spider-Man's world white people? We gotta add some color to the mix. We gotta make MJ different. We gotta make Flash Thompson completely different. Okay, Flash Thompson is no longer the jock who picks on geeky Peter Parker. Now he's also kind of a geek, but he's a really rich kid, and that whole thing is just a mess. You didn't need to do all that. Listen, if Marvel really cared about social diversity, and they really cared about being different, and all this stuff that people claim went into this, and honestly, I haven't been able to confirm half the stuff people say, but I feel like the idea of completely changing MJ and Flash Thompson probably had a lot to do with this idea that you want to have a quote-unquote whitewash of the cast, okay? You don't have to change everything, though. If you really care about diversity, and you really care about being modern and different and progressive and blah, 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 let me give you a tip. Really quick tip. There's this Spider-Man called Miles Morales. He's half African-American, and he's half Hispanic. And in his world, there's a lot of diversity. And the villains are diverse. And his love life is diverse. And his friends are diverse. And you could have made Miles Morales the Spider-Man of the MCU. But you went back to the Peter Parker instead, and you had to rewrite his love life and rewrite all of his relationships and change his social dynamics for the sake of diversity? That's the dumbest explanation ever. You could have just gone with Miles Morales, and you could have given us something we've never seen before, something beautiful and wonderful. Listen, Tom Holland is great. Tom Holland is incredible. But you changed Peter Parker's social environment, which takes away from what makes Peter Parker unique. While the story was excellent written, and Tom Holland is excellent playing the role, and the movie has a great storyline, and the MCU did a great job of balancing all the pieces involved. Michael Keaton is great as the villain. There was no reason to rewrite MJ and Flash Thompson. There was no reason to change the social dynamic of Peter Parker's life, because it's what takes away from what makes him unique, what makes him someone that kids look up to. All right, as you've noticed, I haven't talked about a Tobey Maguire movie since the worst movie on the list. And that is because the first 2 Spider-Man movies ever, in my opinion, are the best. And there's a couple of reasons why. Number one, the interpretation of Sam Raimi and the people who wrote and directed the first two Spider-Man movies, they were true to as much of the source material as possible. And Stan Lee was involved in the writing of the movie. So you had the person who created Spider-Man, the person who envisioned Spider-Man all those years ago, and they took Steve Ditko's comics and they handed it to a writer and said, make me a screenplay. The reason why the Sam Raimi movies, their first two movies, Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2, are the best Spider-Man movies is because they come directly from the source. You don't always have to remake the wheel. You don't always have to rewrite history. You don't always have to change everything. Sometimes things don't need to be rewritten. Sometimes they can just be the way it was intended, and it can still be awesome. And that's what Sam Raimi proved, and that's what Spider-Man 1 and 2 proved. Now, you might be asking, well, how do you rank the movies? Well, my number 2 movie is not Spider-Man 2. It's actually Spider-Man 1. And the only reason why Spider-Man 1 is not the number 1 movie is because I think Spider-Man 2 did a better job at executing and building upon Spider-Man 1, where Spider-Man 1 was literally the first thing we saw. I think that Sam Raimi and everybody involved actually did a very good job at building upon the first movie. And part of the reason why number 2 is better than number 1 is because there was a group of people involved in writing the movie that are some of the best on the planet when it comes to these stories. For those who don't know, the people who were involved in writing Spider-Man 2 were also involved in the television show Smallville. Alfred Gough and Miles Millar were the primary writers for the entirety of Smallville. They brought those two men onto Spider-Man 2. And Spider-Man 2 came out about a few years into Smallville. The writers Alfred Gough and Miles Millar have been involved in a lot of projects over the years. But their biggest accomplishment, most people would agree, was Smallville. And that launched both of their success for years after that. Both of their involvement in this was a stroke of genius by Sam Raimi and Sony. They said, we want to bring in writers who understand what it's like to take a character to the next step, who understand what it means to take a character from point A to point B. So Spider-Man 2 had better writing, better execution, better development, and they said, how can we outdo the first movie? We're going to bring in two great writers who understand teenagers, superheroes, innocence, complexity, and that's why 2 is better than 1. Now, let's get into Spider-Man 1. Tobey Maguire is the original Peter Parker the majority of the world identifies on the big screen. While Andrew Garfield is the best Spider-Man in costume, and Tom Holland is the most believable Spider-Man as a teenager, what Tobey Maguire executed the best among anything else is that intellectually, he was the best Spider-Man. Intellectually, the transference from Peter Parker to Spider-Man was practically seamless. You believed Spider-Man was smart. You believed Peter Parker was smart. You believed Spider-Man was a good person. You believed Spider-Man was trying to do things the right way. Tobey Maguire does a great job of that in both movies. Mary Jane Watson, played by Kirsten Dunst. Again, Mary Jane was not the original love of Spider-Man, but the way they wrote her role, the way she executed the role was incredible in both movies. The scene in the first movie where Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson kiss for the first time is one of the most incredibly executed shots ever in a movie. It was incredibly well done. It was incredibly emotional, and it was incredibly impactful for the audience. Cliff Robertson's portrayal of Ben Parker, Uncle Ben for Peter Parker, incredible. Rosemary Harris, when you think of Aunt May in the comics, you pretty much see her. She does a great job at the role. It's believable. Listen, in the second two Spider-Man movies, the Amazing Spider-Man, they tried to one up the first movie, okay? They tried to go from Rosemary Harris to Sally Fields. They went from Cliff Robertson to Martin Sheen. They're trying to outdo themselves. But Cliff Robertson and Rosemary Harris, what made them work as Ben and May Parker is that they're not super famous A-list actors and actresses. They're not these super famous people. They're so great at acting that you almost don't see them. J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson has been and forever always will be the best J. Jonah, and I hope they bring him back for the third Spider-Man movie in the MCU, because the way he yells and the way he pounds the table and the way he storms around, it's everything we see on the comics. And J.K. Simmons is also a great actor. I love it. And last but not least is the villain. William Dafoe is the archetype for every superhero villain after this Spider-Man movie. William Dafoe is the standard for every villain in every superhero movie for the next 20 years. William Dafoe shows you what it means to be complex, manipulative, underhanded, aggressive, just everything you want a great antagonist to be in a story. Dafoe set the standard. There is no Josh Brolin as Thanos. There is no James Spader as Ultron. There is no other villains in future Marvel movies if not for William Dafoe. William Dafoe took the role of Harry Osborn and evolved and morphed into the Green Goblin in a way that was so important for this movie to be good. And it was so important for every other Marvel movie for all time. Every villain that you have ever seen in a Marvel movie and how well they are done, how well they are executed, okay? There is no Robert Redford in the second Captain America movie if William Dafoe wasn't there 10 years before that ever happened. There is not all these other characters to come along if William Dafoe didn't step up and say, I am a well-respected actor, and I'm going to come in here, and I'm not just going to play this role and collect a paycheck. I am going to own this role. I am going to show you what evil looks like. And the only person since William Dafoe that is up the ante on their role, Heath Ledger in the Batman Dark Knight movie. And then after him, Josh Brolin as Thanos. There's a reason why those guys are incredible villains, but it was started with William Dafoe. Furthermore, the story arc of the movie and the action sequences set the standard for every superhero movie for the next 20 years. Every action sequence, every story arc, its quality, its substance, everything owes it to Spider-Man 1, which is why Spider-Man 2 had to outdo it. And you bring in the writers of Smallville, and you bring in two of the best writers of their time to write this movie, and you get Tobey Maguire executing the difficult balance of being Peter Parker in his personal life and being Spider-Man. And that will make Spider-Man 2 my number one, because Tobey Maguire has better writing, and he is peak execution. The special effects of the fight scenes were ahead of their time. That whole fight scene in the library where Peter Parker's flipping around and Dr. Octavius is coming after him, it's incredible. Alfred Molina does a great job at portraying a complex villain who, in the end, sacrifices himself to save the world. The great thing about Spider-Man comics is that Spider-Man's villains, not all of them are pure evil. they're just misunderstood or misled. I was disappointed that Dr. Connors shows up in this movie. He doesn't have more of a role in the Spider-Man universe because Dr. Connors has a huge role in the Spider-Man mythos, but I digress. I can't be mad about one misstep by the movie. I love the fact that James Franco, they continue to evolve his character as well. You know, you're introduced to him in the first movie, and then the second movie, he takes another step toward the darkness and another step toward, being angry at Spider-Man and blaming him for his father's death. And you're wondering, what is going on with Harry Osborn and why is he so messed up? And Peter Parker doesn't understand. He's trying to figure it out. And there's that whole dynamic between Harry and MJ and Peter Parker, and that is well executed by the writers and the actors. Plus, you get more J. Jonah Jameson. Not enough. And you get his son, John Jameson, a classic throwback to the comics as well. And you're getting all these little things throughout the movie, and it's so well written, and it's so well executed, and you're really not going to appreciate it unless you watch it multiple times, because when you watch it multiple times, you realize that this movie is Spider-Man was not the hero, and you changed all the names, and you changed some of the stuff in the special effects. The movie is still great. And that's why it's number one. Because if Spider-Man was not the name of the movie and Peter Parker's name was different, and it wasn't Doc Ock who was the villain, it was a more grounded villain who's not based in science fiction, it would still be a great movie. And that's why it's number one on my list. So that's the Spider-Man movies ranked. I'm Josh Hennig, your host of the Mutant Blitz Podcast. I appreciate you indulging me on these rankings. I appreciate you also letting me know. What do you think? Hit me up on Twitter at Josh Hennig. Shoot me a message on Twitter. Again, at Josh Hennig, Hennig. Let me know what you think. Why do you disagree? Where do you go left or right? My list is not set in stone. It's typed. I can move and delete things. I can shuffle around. I'm not sold that Spider-Man 1 has to be 2 and Spider-Man 2 has to be 1. If someone wants to come along and tell me that Homecoming should be higher or that Spider-Man 1 with Andrew Garfield should be lower than 4, I'm willing to have those conversations. But I gave you my reasoning. Let me know yours. I try to be as objective with this list as humanly possible so I can give you a presentation of Spider-Man history. And frankly, I feel like I am one of the most qualified people to talk about Spider-Man because of the fact that Spider-Man was the first comic I ever read. And I've read a ton of Spider-Man comics, and Spider-Man is nowhere near my favorite Marvel character. He's probably closer to 5th. So I've read a ton of Spider-Man. I really appreciate him and his history, but I'm not a die-hard lover of Spider-Man. So I do have a level of objectivity when it comes to the character, because frankly, there are times in the comics I hated Peter Parker. I thought he was annoying, and I couldn't stand how he was acting at times, but I understood why, and I was able to accept it and work with it. And I hope that my objectivity maybe helped you understand a little bit better why some of these movies were so good and the flaws in the movies that maybe you previously thought were, absolutely perfect or absolutely, one way or the other. Hope you subscribe to the podcast. I'm Josh Hennig, and I'll catch you next time for another edition of the Mutant Blitz Podcast.